Emily stood by the bedroom mirror, gently smoothing the front of her floral maternity dress over her swollen belly. At 28, she had imagined pregnancy would be a blend of messy cravings and swollen ankles, but for her, it was more than that. It was the beautiful beginning of a new chapter with the man she loved. She placed a hand over the curve of her stomach and smiled softly. The baby kicked in response, as if to say hello. She chuckled and whispered, "You're Daddy and I can't wait to meet you." Her husband, Ryan, was already downstairs sipping his coffee, dressed in one of his tailored suits, scrolling through emails on his phone. He glanced up and flashed his usual charismatic smile. "You ready for your big checkup, Em?" he asked, his voice full of practiced warmth. Emily adored that about Ryan. His charm. He always knew what to say, when to say it. They had met 5 years ago at a property expo where Ryan had been hosting a real estate seminar. He was successful, well-dressed, and undeniably magnetic. The way he'd pursued her had felt like something out of a movie. She had fallen quickly, and she'd fallen hard. Now, nearly 7 months pregnant, Emily believed she was living a dream. A beautiful suburban home, a baby on the way, and a husband with a thriving career. It wasn't perfect, but nothing ever was. Still, she felt grateful. Ryan was often busy with work, late meetings, last-minute showings, business trips that seemed to multiply, but she chalked it up to his ambition. Every time she brought up his constant absence or the way he grew distant, he would pull her into a hug, tell her how much he loved her, and promise things would settle down after the baby arrived. Her only family, her older brother Mason, had always been protective of her. But he'd been away for months on one of his charity ventures in South Africa, building schools and providing clean water to rural villages. They talked occasionally, but she hadn't shared her quiet fears with him. What was there to say? She was happy, or at least she was supposed to be. As Ryan drove her to the clinic, holding her hand over the gearshift and humming to a radio tune, Emily leaned her head back and smiled. Everything felt right. Her life, her future, it was all coming together. Until that day changed everything. The air inside the clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender, an odd but comforting mix that Emily had grown used to over the months. She signed in at the front desk, clutching her pregnancy file to her chest as she made her way to the waiting area. Her appointment was scheduled with Dr. Hale, her regular OB/GYN, and Emily looked forward to these moments. The calm hum of the waiting room, the excited flutter in her heart when she heard her baby's heartbeat. It always made everything feel real, like all the discomfort and sleepless nights had a purpose. Ryan had dropped her off, saying he needed to take a quick call in the parking lot and would be back in a few minutes. Emily hadn't thought much of it. Lately, he'd always been juggling calls and clients. Real estate was unpredictable, he'd told her, and she'd believed him. She sank into one of the cushioned chairs and pulled out a parenting magazine from the side table. As she flipped through an article on nursery safety, something caught her eye, a tall man walking out of one of the private consultation rooms down the hall. Her heart skipped. It was Ryan. But he wasn't alone. A woman followed closely behind him, adjusting the strap of her designer purse. She was striking, mid-20s, long chestnut hair that curled perfectly at the ends, tight-fitting dress that hugged her hourglass figure, and heels that clicked with every step. Emily froze, her body numb as she watched her husband lean in slightly, whisper something to the woman that made her giggle. The woman, Vanessa, Emily would soon learn, placed her hand gently on his chest. It was a touch that was too familiar, too intimate to mistake. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. A cold wave rushed over her body, even though the room was warm. She stood slowly, her legs trembling beneath her, and moved toward the hallway. She hadn't planned to say anything, she hadn't even processed what she was seeing, until the woman's voice floated through the air, soft but sharp. "I can't wait till she's out of the picture," Vanessa whispered. The words were a dagger. Emily gasped. Ryan turned, startled to see her standing there, pale-faced and wide-eyed. For a moment, his polished mask slipped. Panic flickered across his face. Then it vanished, replaced by the same calm expression he always wore when selling million-dollar homes. "Emily," he said smoothly, stepping toward her. "What are you doing out here? I told you to wait inside." Her voice cracked. "Who is she?" She's a client, Ryan said quickly. I was helping her with a property investment consultation. She's thinking of buying near the hospital. Emily looked past him at Vanessa, who now seemed amused by the unfolding scene. The younger woman gave Emily a once-over, her gaze lingering on the baby bump, and smirked. Emily's breath hitched. Her instincts screamed the truth at her, but she swallowed it. Not here. Not now. The baby shifted inside her, sensing her stress. She placed her hand protectively on her stomach, and forced herself to stay calm. For the baby, she whispered to herself in her mind. She looked Ryan in the eyes. We'll talk later. Without waiting for a reply, she turned and walked back to the waiting room. Her legs felt like lead, her hands shaking. She didn't know what hurt more, the betrayal, or the fact that part of her had already suspected it. The silence in the car that evening was suffocating. Ryan had offered to pick her up after the appointment like nothing had happened, acting as if her confrontation in the clinic hallway was just an overreaction. Emily sat in the passenger seat, staring blankly out the window, her hands protectively resting on her belly. He made shallow conversation about traffic and how busy his day had been, but she barely heard him. Her thoughts were a chaotic storm, Vanessa's hand on his chest, her cruel words, Ryan's polished lie. Back home, Emily waited until Ryan went into his home office before sneaking into the bedroom and grabbing his laptop. Her hands trembled as she opened it, half praying she'd find nothing. But part of her knew she would. The password was still the same, her birthday, ironically. Within minutes, the truth unraveled like a tightly wound thread snapping loose. There were dozens of emails, messages, and photos. Conversations with Vanessa going back over a year. Trips to Chicago, Miami, and even one just an hour away in a cozy lake resort where Ryan had claimed to be attending a real estate seminar. Photos of them in robes, in restaurants, in bed. Vanessa sent him ultrasound pictures, her own. The timestamp on one was just a week ago. Emily's stomach clenched. Her breathing grew shallow. Vanessa wasn't just a fling. She was a second life. Ryan had built a parallel world, one where Emily didn't exist, where she was just the obstacle he returned to when he needed to maintain his image. She thought back to the little signs. The late-night calls he'd always taken in the garage. The way he'd stopped coming to her OB/GYN appointments, citing last-minute emergencies. How he'd started sleeping in the guest room and brushing off her touch with casual excuses about needing space. The romantic dinners that had faded into silence. The way he flinched when she talked about baby names. It all made sense now, and it shattered her. When Ryan came upstairs later, she was sitting on the edge of the bed, his laptop open beside her. Her face was pale, her eyes bloodshot. He paused in the doorway. You went through my computer? Emily's voice was a whisper. You lied to me. For how long? Ryan sighed, rubbing his temples. Don't make a scene, Em. It's not good for the baby. She stood slowly, hands shaking. She's pregnant. Vanessa. You've been seeing her for over a year. He looked at her for a long moment, then shrugged. So what if she is? At least she's not boring. Emily blinked, stunned. What? You don't listen anymore. You talk about diapers and baby names and curtains. That's it. You've become someone I can't even recognize. Her knees buckled. She reached for the dresser to steady herself, her heart pounding in her ears. The betrayal, the dismissal, it was too much. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she whispered, I gave up everything for you. Ryan didn't respond. He just walked into the bathroom and closed the door. Emily crumbled to the floor, her sobs silent and broken. She wrapped her arms around her belly as if she could shield her baby from the pain. Her world had collapsed in a single night. Everything she believed in was gone, replaced by a cruel truth she could never unsee. She had never felt more alone. The house was dark, lit only by the faint glow from the kitchen under-cabinet lights. Ryan was asleep in the guest room, door closed, indifferent and emotionally absent, just like he'd been for months. Emily sat on the edge of their bed, suitcase open at her feet, slowly folding clothes through her tears. Her hands moved automatically, grabbing soft maternity wear, prenatal vitamins, the folder with her medical records, and the ultrasound photo she'd once placed proudly on the fridge. Now, it felt like a cruel reminder of the future she'd imagined with a man who had no intention of being part of it. The clock read 1:27 a.m. She zipped the suitcase with a shaky breath, her heart pounding in her chest like a drumbeat of fear and finality. She wasn't sure where she was going, just that she had to leave. Staying in this house, in this pain, in Ryan's presence, it was killing her slowly. As she dragged the suitcase down the stairs, her thoughts spiraled back to everything she had given up. Her career as a graphic designer had been promising, filled with freelance offers and a budding portfolio. But when Ryan asked her to focus on building their home, she let it go. He said they didn't need two people working. He said he'd take care of everything. And she believed him, thinking it was love, not control. She had shelved her dreams, her ambitions, even her friends, isolating herself in a marriage that disguised ownership as affection. Now, the pieces of who she used to be felt like broken fragments, shards she barely recognized. As she stepped outside, the cold night air hit her face. She tossed her bag into the back seat and climbed behind the wheel of her car. Her hands shook on the steering wheel, and her belly felt tight with tension. She whispered, "It's okay, baby. We'll be okay," even though she didn't believe it yet. On instinct, she dialed Mason's number. Her older brother, her protector, would know what to do. But the call didn't go through. A robotic voice said he was unreachable. Probably still in the remote village he'd mentioned in his last email, with no cell service. A sob rose in her throat, but she forced it down and started the engine. She drove for hours, not toward home, but toward familiarity, the small town where she and Mason had grown up. It wasn't far, just a couple hours away, but with every mile, the reality of her situation grew heavier. By the time the neon vacancy sign of a roadside motel came into view, her body was trembling. Her limbs felt heavy, her vision blurry. She parked unevenly and staggered into the front office. The clerk, an older woman with tired eyes, took one look at Emily and said nothing as she handed over the key to room 7. The motel room was dim and cold. Emily dropped her bag by the door and collapsed onto the bed fully dressed. Her heart ached, her back throbbed, and every inch of her soul felt bruised. She stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of betrayal, confusion, and fear pressing down on her chest. She hadn't eaten since morning. Her body was screaming for rest, for nutrition, for comfort. When she finally stood to get some water from the bathroom, the edges of her vision dimmed. Her knees buckled. She barely made it to the sink before everything went dark. The last thing she remembered was the whisper of her own voice, hoarse and broken. "Please, not the baby." The sun had barely risen over Geneva when Mason checked his messages after landing a major deal for his global water initiative. Among the usual congratulations and logistical updates was one that made his stomach drop, a voice note from an old neighbor back home, urgent and stammering. Emily had been found unconscious in a rundown motel and rushed to the hospital. No other details. No explanation. Just panic. By the time he boarded the first flight back to the States, Mason's heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might crack his ribs. His mind raced with worst-case scenarios. He hadn't spoken to Emily in weeks. Not because he didn't care, he thought of her every day, but because she'd insisted everything was fine in their last call. Her voice had sounded light, cheerful even. But Mason knew his sister. She had always tried to shield him from her pain, even when they were kids. When he stepped into the hospital's maternity ward, his tailored coat soaked from the rain, the sterile scent hit him like a punch. His eyes scanned the room until he found her. Emily looked fragile under the pale blue blanket, an 4 taped to her arm and monitors softly beeping beside her. Her face was pale, lips cracked, and her once sparkling eyes stared at the ceiling as if searching for answers that weren't there. Mason's throat tightened. He moved to her side, knelt beside the bed, and gently took her hand. She stirred at the touch, her eyes focusing slowly. The moment she saw him, her tears came in a quiet flood. Mason, she whispered. He brought her hand to his lips. You should have called me, he said, voice raw. I would have come the second you needed me. I didn't want to worry you, she choked out. I thought I could handle it. But everything fell apart. She didn't need to say more. Mason pieced together what had happened from the sorrow in her voice, the tremble in her fingers, and the nurse's casual mention of stress-induced complications. And then he heard the name, Ryan. Mason's expression hardened like stone. The brother who had once helped her build tree forts, who'd fought off school bullies twice his size for her, now stood as a powerful force in a far more dangerous fight. He was no longer just her big brother. He was Mason Carrington, one of the most respected philanthropic entrepreneurs in the world, with connections that reached into law, business, and media. He stood slowly, jaw clenched. I'm going to take you away from all this, he said, his voice sharp and sure. You and that baby will never have to deal with Ryan again. I swear it. Emily blinked up at him, too weak to respond, but the relief in her eyes said enough. Mason turned to the nurse. Get the discharge forms ready. I'm taking my sister home. And with that, the war for Emily's freedom had begun. Ryan's office was perched on the top floor of a sleek glass building, one he often boasted about during networking events. Corner office, full skyline view. But that morning, he barely had time to enjoy his espresso before the door burst open with a sharp click. Mason Carrington walked in without knocking. Dressed in a dark tailored suit, his jaw tight and eyes blazing, Mason didn't say a word at first. He simply tossed a thick manila envelope onto Ryan's polished desk. It landed with a satisfying slap. Ryan blinked in surprise, slowly setting down his cup. Mason. I didn't know you were back in the country. I'm sure you didn't, Mason replied coldly. You've been busy ruining my sister's life. Ryan's smile faltered. He reached for the envelope and opened it, skimming the pages. Divorce papers. Legal documents. Full custody petitions. Asset division terms. All already signed by Emily. All backed by one of the most aggressive legal teams in the country. Ryan leaned back in his chair, trying to regain control. Now, hold on. Emily's upset, I get that. But this is a little extreme, don't you think? Mason stepped forward, placing both hands flat on the desk, voice low and lethal. She ended up in the hospital because of you. Stressed. Alone. Nearly lost the baby. You think this is extreme? You're lucky I'm doing it legally. Ryan scoffed. She overreacted. I told her the truth. I'm not going to apologize for wanting more in life. You wanted more? You wanted 2 lives, one with my sister and one with your mistress, who, by the way, is pregnant too. Mason's eyes narrowed. You think this ends with just divorce? I've got evidence of financial fraud, undeclared assets, illegal investment schemes. You've been sloppy. Very sloppy. Ryan's face paled. Mason straightened, smoothing his jacket. You're going to sign over the house. The vehicles. A generous monthly support package. You'll have no claim to the child. No visitation. No contact. And in exchange, I'll keep your dirty secrets out of the press, for now. Ryan stood abruptly. You can't just. Oh, but I can, Mason interrupted, a cold smile touching his lips. Half your clients already pulled out this morning. Your business partner, Charles, found out about the mistress and the fake housing permits. He's cutting ties. Vanessa. He gave a mocking shrug. She's already packed her bags. She knows what a sinking ship looks like. Ryan sank back into his chair, stunned. How the hell did you pull this off? You don't get to know how I operate, Mason said, turning toward the door. All you need to know is that if you come near Emily again, in any way, I won't go through lawyers next time. Mason left without waiting for a response. Back at the private estate, Emily sat curled up on a velvet sofa, a blanket over her lap, watching the sun filter through the wide bay windows. The tension in her body had eased slightly, but a deep weariness lingered in her bones. When Mason returned, she turned to him, eyes wide with quiet fear. "Did he fight back?" "No," Mason said, kneeling beside her. "He folded. Everything's handled. You're free, Em. You're safe now." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time, they weren't from pain. For the first time in weeks, she felt something she hadn't dared to hope for. Relief. Mason tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "From now on, you and your baby won't have to look over your shoulder. I'll handle everything. You just focus on healing." In that moment, Emily realized something profound. She wasn't broken. She was being rebuilt, piece by piece, by the one person who had never stopped protecting her. The estate was nestled in the hills, far from the noise, far from the memories. Mason's private sanctuary was sprawling and serene, surrounded by acres of wildflowers, sunlight-drenched courtyards, and gentle walking paths that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. When Emily first arrived, she felt like a guest in a life far too peaceful to be hers. But Mason had made one thing clear: this was her home now, for as long as she needed it. He had arranged everything before she even stepped foot on the grounds. A prenatal specialist came twice a week. A soft-spoken therapist visited her every morning after breakfast. A yoga instructor guided her through gentle stretches by the garden, focusing on breathing, mindfulness, and the quiet strength her body held as it carried life. At first, Emily simply went through the motions, but with each passing day, she began to feel herself slowly returning. The constant ache in her chest eased, replaced by cautious calm. The nightmares faded. And in the stillness of her new surroundings, Emily found something she hadn't felt in weeks: room to breathe. One afternoon, while unpacking a box Mason had brought from her old house, she found her old journal. The leather cover was worn, the pages partially filled with scribbled hopes and design sketches from years ago, back when she'd dreamed of opening her own boutique studio. A life that had once seemed possible, before Ryan had convinced her that her talents were just hobbies. She sat at her new writing desk, a sunbeam warming her back, and opened the book. Her pen hovered for a moment. Then it moved. Line after line poured out: pain, relief, small thoughts, big questions, everything that had been buried beneath silence. She wrote about her baby, the soft kicks that now came like clockwork in the evenings. About the dreams that once scared her but now felt like seeds ready to grow again. When Mason came in one evening and found her sketching nursery layouts and wallpaper concepts, he smiled. "I knew she was still in there," he said gently. That week, he made her an offer. Not charity, not pity, just belief. "I want you to lead the creative side of my new design division," he told her. "The whole aesthetic, the brand, the vision. Yours." Emily hesitated. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Mason replied. "You're not broken, Em. You were just caged." The role gave her purpose. Mornings were spent on mood boards and virtual meetings. Evenings were quiet and filled with soft music, warm tea, and baby kicks that seemed to come every time she laughed. She began smiling again. Not out of habit, not for show, but from a quiet place of peace growing inside her. Each day reminded her, she was not what Ryan left behind. She was what came after. Thunder cracked outside the estate as heavy rain pounded the windows like fists from the sky. Emily paced slowly in the hallway, one hand cradling her belly, the other gripping the wall for support. The air was thick with tension, the sky growling in distant waves. A sharp pain shot through her abdomen, stronger than before. She paused, closing her eyes, breathing in and out just like her instructor had taught her. "Mason!" she called, her voice shaky but urgent. He was at her side in seconds, barefoot, rain dripping from his hair. He'd just come in from securing the patio furniture. One look at her face, and he knew. "It's time, isn't it?" Emily nodded, tears of both pain and fear slipping down her cheeks. "The contractions, they're close. Really close." Without hesitation, Mason grabbed the overnight bag he'd packed days ago, slung his arm around her for support, and guided her to the car. The thunderstorm had turned the roads into a blur of reflections, lightning streaking across the windshield. But Mason drove with focus and urgency, his jaw clenched, one hand gripping the steering wheel, the other reaching back now and then to touch her shoulder, grounding her. At the hospital, the staff recognized her instantly. Mason had already ensured her chart was flagged for privacy and protection. They rushed her into a delivery room, monitors beeping, nurses moving with calm precision. Mason never left her side. He held her hand, whispered encouragement, and refused to even sit down. Emily gripped his hand so tightly he thought his bones might snap, but he never flinched. "I'm right here," he repeated, over and over, voice steady even when her cries filled the room. Hours passed. And then, just as the storm outside began to ease, a new sound filled the room. A cry. Tiny, pure, and powerful. The doctor smiled. "It's a girl." Emily collapsed back against the pillows, tears spilling freely. The nurse placed the baby on her chest, warm and wrinkled and perfect. She looked down at her daughter with awe and whispered, "Hope." Mason wiped his eyes as he leaned in, overcome. "Hope," he repeated. "That's exactly what she is." Emily looked up at him. "Do you want to hold her?" He nodded, barely able to speak. When the nurse placed the newborn into his arms, Mason stared down at her, his tough exterior completely undone. "I swear to you," he whispered, eyes shimmering, "I'll protect you both. Always." Outside the delivery room, a brief commotion stirred. Ryan had somehow learned she was in labor. He tried to enter, demanded to see her, as if he still had a right. But security, acting on the court's emergency restraining order Mason had quietly filed weeks earlier, turned him away without question. He watched from the lobby as the rain poured outside, powerless, alone. Back inside, Emily held her daughter close, the sound of her soft breathing matching the rhythm of the world finally calming down around them. For the first time in a long while, Emily wasn't afraid. She had survived. And now, with hope in her arms, she was finally whole. News of Ryan's downfall traveled quickly. Within weeks of Emily's delivery, his once booming real estate firm crumbled like a house built on sand. Mason had used every connection at his disposal, ethical, powerful, and relentless. He'd exposed Ryan's shady investment schemes, backdoor deals, and fabricated property values. Former clients pulled out. Investors sued. Partners distanced themselves overnight. Ryan's name, once polished and praised, was now synonymous with fraud. Vanessa, realizing the luxurious life she'd envisioned was gone, filed a paternity case in a desperate attempt to secure financial stability. But Ryan had nothing left to give. His accounts were frozen, his assets seized or drained in legal battles, and his reputation too tainted to recover. The lavish car, the condo, even the office furniture, auctioned off to pay debts. She left him soon after, angry and pregnant, without even a parting goodbye. From the safety of Mason's estate, Emily watched it all unfold quietly. Not with glee or bitterness, just with a deep sense of closure. There was no joy in his suffering, but there was peace in knowing that she no longer had to carry the weight of his betrayal. What had happened to Ryan wasn't revenge. It was the consequence of every lie he'd told, every life he'd tried to juggle, and every vow he'd broken. Mason arranged for a final court hearing. The judge reviewed the evidence calmly but sternly. Ryan barely showed up, disheveled, defeated, a shell of the man he once pretended to be. The courtroom fell silent as the ruling was handed down. Emily was granted sole custody of Hope, without contest. Ryan was ordered to provide long-term alimony, a condition backed by the last remaining assets Mason had strategically frozen before Ryan's collapse. A trust fund for Hope's education and future needs was secured under Mason's oversight, completely out of Ryan's reach. As Emily stepped out of the courthouse that day, the sun was warm on her face. Hope rested against her chest, dozing peacefully in her sling. Mason walked beside her, his presence steady, his expression calm. She inhaled deeply, filling her lungs with freedom. Not hatred. Not grief. Just peace. Ryan was behind her now. And everything ahead, every step, every sunrise, every breath, belonged entirely to her. 1 year later, The ribbon fluttered in the breeze as Emily stood outside the newly opened Haven Wellness Center, her arms wrapped gently around Hope, now a bright-eyed, chubby-cheeked toddler with curls as soft as silk. The building behind her was modern, serene, and full of light, painted in warm tones and surrounded by wildflowers, just like the ones that grew outside Mason's estate. It was a place of healing, safety, and second chances. And it was hers. Funded through a generous grant from the Carrington Foundation, the center offered prenatal care, counseling, support groups, and creative therapy for women who had suffered emotional abuse, abandonment, or betrayal. It was everything Emily had once needed but hadn't known how to ask for. Now, she was determined to be the voice that told other women, "You are not alone." She stood in front of a small group of guests and survivors during the opening ceremony, Hope on her hip, and delivered her first talk. Her voice was calm but full of quiet strength. "I lost everything I thought I needed to be whole," she said, glancing down at her daughter. "But it led me to everything I truly needed: healing, purpose, and love." The crowd applauded gently, a few women dabbing tears from their eyes. Behind them, Mason stood beaming with pride, arm wrapped around Dr. Lena Hart, the OB/GYN who had delivered Hope and had since become more than just a family friend. The ring on her finger sparkled as brightly as the love in her eyes every time she looked at Mason. Their wedding was just a few months away, and Emily couldn't be happier for them. Emily and Hope now lived in a cozy villa just 10 minutes from the center. White shutters, a blooming garden, soft music playing from the windows. It was a home full of warmth and laughter. Some mornings, they'd bake muffins together. Other days, Emily would sit at her writing desk while Hope colored beside her, the world quiet and safe. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, casting everything in a golden haze, Emily rocked Hope gently on the porch. The sky was streaked in hues of rose and amber, and peace filled the air like a warm blanket. She smiled softly to herself. Sometimes, betrayal didn't destroy you. Sometimes, it guided you right back to the people who had always loved you most.